Rome in 1633 was a city of stone and ceremony, where authority was meant to feel older than any living person. In the courts and offices near the heart of the city, judgment moved with a deliberate slowness. Papers changed hands, wax seals were warmed and pressed. Doors closed behind murmured consultations. Nothing about the process felt improvised. It felt like the continuation of something ancient, a system built to outlast the tempers and confusions of ordinary men. In one of those rooms, a chair waited beneath the attention of officials trained to treat speech as a matter of order. The man who would be asked to sit there was not a soldier, not a rebel, not a preacher. He was an aging mathematician from Tuscany named Galileo Galilei. The charge, in the language of the time, was not framed as an attack on science, because that category did not yet exist in the modern sense. What was on the table was something more basic, the right to speak publicly about how the world was built and the authority by which such claims could be made. To understand why Rome would summon a man like Galileo, it helps to notice what had already begun to happen to the European mind. For centuries, most educated people had lived inside a kind of coherence that was as much emotional as it was intellectual. The universe was not just space filled with objects, it was a home. Nature had an order that could be read, and that order carried meaning. The heavens were not merely lights in the dark. They belonged to a structure that placed human beings inside a moral world. Knowledge did not arrive as bare information. Knowledge arrived with a place to stand. It came through tradition, through authority, through interpretation, and through a story that told you not only what was true, but what mattered and why. By the early 17th century, that coherence was strained. Religious unity had fractured. Rival readings of Scripture had turned belief into a battlefield. Printing multiplied arguments faster than institutions could calm them. In some places, men killed each other over doctrines that had once felt like shared ground. Even when the streets were quiet, the mind was not. A civilization that had once trusted a single center to bind its meanings together was learning, painfully, that it no longer had one. In that atmosphere, anxiety did not always look like panic. It looked like a slow disease of doubt. It felt like standing on a floor that was still there, but no longer certain to hold. Because once the habits that once produced agreement begin to fail, the fear is not simply error. The fear is fragmentation. The fear is that reality itself might become something no counsel can close, something no inherited method can seal. And then another kind of pressure arrived. It came quietly, without armies or sermons. It came through lenses and measurements, through diagrams and numbers, through careful observation repeated until it yielded the same result again and again. This way of knowing did not need a lineage to speak. It did not need permission. It only needed consistency. It offered conclusions that felt stubborn, almost indifferent to human concerns. For institutions charged with keeping a civilization coherent, that indifference was unsettling, because a truth that arrives without belonging, without moral framing, without a shared narrative, can still be true. And if it is true, it rearranges more than astronomy. It rearranges authority. That was the deeper pressure behind Galileo's summons to Rome in 1633. The hearing that followed would be remembered as a trial. But what it truly exposed was a civilization trying to decide whether it could survive the kind of truth it was beginning to discover. Nearly 90 years earlier, the pressure had arrived in a form that looked harmless: paper, ink, and a set of calculations. Nuremberg, 1543. In a printer's workshop, thick with the smell of oil and metal type, men laid pages out to dry and checked lines of Latin as if they were checking the seams of a ship. The book was about the heavens, But it was also about something more disturbing, the right to treat the sky as a mathematical problem rather than a moral tableau. The author, a cautious canon from the far north named Nicolaus Copernicus, was not writing like a man trying to ignite a revolution. He was writing like a man trying to make the numbers behave. For centuries, astronomers had worked inside a model of the cosmos that matched what everyone seemed to see. The Earth was still. The sun rose and crossed the sky. The stars turned like a dome. To keep the math aligned with observation, the old system required adjustments, circles on circles, corrections upon corrections, until it began to resemble a machine made of gears that had been fixed too many times. Copernicus offered a different arrangement. Put the sun at the center, and the calculations simplify. The motions become cleaner. The accounting becomes elegant. He did not need, at first, to shout that the sun truly sat at the center like a king on a throne. The more radical claim was quieter. The mathematics works better this way. The sentence contained a new hierarchy. It suggested that a system of logic and number, impersonal and indifferent to human authority, could judge the structure of the world more reliably than the senses of sober men standing together under a clear sky. That was the wedge. If the sky could look one way and the math could insist on another, then the old comfort, that shared experience and shared agreement anchored reality, was no longer sufficient. The book could be treated as a tool, a clever instrument for calculating positions, and many readers did treat it that way. Some even wrapped it in caution, insisting that such models were hypotheses, convenient fictions. But once the door was opened, it was difficult to close. The idea had been planted. Truth might belong not to what the world felt like, but to what the numbers demanded. For decades, the threat stayed mostly inside the quiet rooms of mathematicians and astronomers. It lived in tables and ephemerides, in the work of men whose occupation was to predict where planets would appear. But Europe did not remain quiet. The 16th century tore its own center apart. Churches split, princes chose sides, pamphlets poured off presses. The word authority began to sound less like shelter and more like a weapon because it was used against neighbors. In a world like that, unity becomes a kind of medicine. Institutions learn to fear anything that makes unity harder. A truth can be harmless in a stable society and dangerous in a fractured one, not because truth changes, but because the cost of disagreement rises. By the time Galileo was watching the skies, the question was no longer whether an idea could be argued. The question was whether an idea could be survived. Padua, 1609. Galileo was 45, teaching mathematics in a university town that lived between commerce and learning. He was not yet the symbol he would become. He was a working man of the mind, supporting himself by lecturing, tutoring, building instruments, and navigating the thin line between scholarly respect and financial precarity. He lived in a world where the most valuable currency was not paper money, but patronage, the favor of powerful men who could make your career or break it with a shrug. That year, rumors drifted south from the Low Countries of a curious device, a tube of glass and lens that made distant objects appear near. A spyglass, merchants called it, useful for ships and fortifications. Galileo did what a certain kind of mind does when it hears a rumor like that. He did not wait. He improvised. He ground lenses himself, adjusted shapes, lengthened the tube, and produced a version sharper than what had first been described. One evening he carried the instrument to a tower and aimed it at the familiar geography of the world. The far became close. The city's edges sharpened. The device was a practical wonder. It could be sold as power. A state that could see enemy sails before the enemy could see them had purchased more than glass. It had purchased time. In Venice, power was a matter of time. When Galileo demonstrated the telescope to senators whose livelihoods depended on the sea, he offered them a strategic advantage wrapped in a spectacle. They climbed towers, looked through the tube, and watched distant ships resolve into visible hulls. They rewarded him with salary and esteem. For a moment, it looked like a clean exchange, invention for security. Then Galileo turned the tube upward. In the old cosmos, the heavens were supposed to be the realm of perfection. The moon was a smooth, polished sphere. The stars were fixed lights, embedded in crystalline circles. The sky was not simply above, it was a guarantee that order existed. Through the telescope, the moon betrayed its own mythology. Shadows fell in ways that suggested mountains. A line between dark and light looked rough, not clean. The surface of the moon appeared scarred and textured, like Earth. If the moon was like Earth, then Earth was no longer the singular repository of change and imperfection. The boundary between the sublunary and the celestial, between the corruptible world below and the incorruptible world above, began to blur. The telescope did not just add information. It changed the rules by which information could be trusted. It implied that the human eye, unaided, might be insufficient. It implied that reality could be mediated by a device, and that device could outrank common sense. In January of 1610, Galileo watched Jupiter night after night and noticed something that looked at first like a small error. Tiny points of light near the planet did not hold steady. They shifted position. They disappeared and returned. Over days, the pattern revealed itself. They were not fixed stars. They were bodies circling Jupiter. He had seen, in effect, a miniature system, a planet with its own moons. The Earth was no longer the obvious center of everything that moved. The claim was not yet heliocentrism, but it was a fracture in the story of centrality. It meant the cosmos could contain multiple centers of motion. The universe was more spacious than inherited narrative had allowed. Galileo wrote quickly. He published a short, urgent book, The Starry Messenger, and he attached his discovery to a name that could protect him. He called Jupiter's moons the Medicean stars, offering them as a gift to the ruling family of Florence, the Medici. This was not just flattery, it was strategy. If you wanted to survive ideas that threatened established frameworks, you needed more than evidence. You needed cover. Florence, 1610. Galileo arrived at court with more than a telescope. He arrived with a new kind of prestige. He performed the heavens as an experience. Courtiers looked through the tube and saw the moon's roughness for themselves. They saw moons that were not written about in their books. They felt, in the pit of the stomach, the shock of direct contradiction. The sky is not what it was supposed to be. Patrons love prestige, and Galileo offered them a way to possess it. If the Medici could be linked to celestial discoveries, they could drape themselves in the aura of the new. They appointed him court mathematician and philosopher. They brought him into the orbit of power. But patronage is a bargain with teeth. In Padua, Galileo had lived among professors where disputes were common and reputations were made in argument. In Florence, he lived in a world where reputation was currency and scandal was poison. He gained protection, but he also gained visibility. The telescope that made him famous also made him vulnerable. When you move close to a center, you are seen by everyone who wants your position. The battles that followed were not only about ideas, they were about status. Scholars who had been comfortable inside inherited frameworks now faced a man who could humiliate them publicly with a tube of glass. Some refused to look through the telescope at all, not because they were stupid, but because they understood what looking would force them to admit. If the instrument contradicted the text, which one held authority? That question did not stay inside astronomy. It seeped everywhere. Rome, 1611. Galileo traveled to the city of judgment as a celebrated visitor. In the Collegio Romano, Jesuit scholars, highly trained, mathematically competent, loyal to the church but serious about observation, tested his claims. They looked through telescopes of their own. They checked calculations. They confirmed the moons of Jupiter. They praised the ingenuity. This is where the story becomes harder to flatten into a modern fable. Rome was not filled with men who hated observation. Some of the most skilled astronomers in Europe wore clerical collars. The tension was not between religion and science, because those categories did not map cleanly onto the world. The tension was between different custodianship claims. Who had the right to say what knowledge meant and how far it could go without breaking the structures that held society together? The Jesuits could admire Galileo's discoveries and still resist his conclusions. Many were drawn to a compromise system proposed by Tycho Brahe. Keep Earth at the center, let the Sun orbit Earth, let the other planets orbit the Sun. The model could accommodate much of the new observational evidence without forcing the full Copernican rearrangement. It was, in institutional terms, an attractive solution. Absorb the new facts, preserve the old center. Galileo was not a man built for half measures. He was brilliant, quick, and combative. He enjoyed the knife edge of debate. He had spent decades sharpening his mind against skeptical peers. But Rome was not a university disputation. Rome was an administrative organism with a memory of schism and a fear of heresy. In a city that had watched Christianity fracture, caution was not a personality trait. It was policy. In Florence, the pressure turned theological. A dinner conversation at court, a casual debate over scripture and the heavens, was enough to light the fuse. There were passages, most famously the story of Joshua commanding the sun to stand still, that seemed to assume the sun moved and earth stood firm. For centuries, these passages had been read within a larger framework that treated the Bible as a source of ultimate authority. If a new cosmology contradicted that reading, someone would have to decide how Scripture should be interpreted. Galileo wrote letters. In one, he argued that Scripture was not written to teach astronomy, and that when demonstrable knowledge showed a physical fact, Scripture should be interpreted in a way consistent with that fact. The argument was not new in Christian thought. Theologians had long recognized that biblical language could be accommodated to human understanding. But in a post-Reformation climate, such arguments became radioactive. If Scripture could be reinterpreted on the basis of mathematical and observational claims, then the authority to interpret Scripture could drift from clerical and institutional custody into the hands of anyone clever enough to make a persuasive case. The danger was not merely doctrinal, it was procedural. It was about who gets to decide. Galileo, in his confidence, stepped into terrain where he could not control the consequences. A mathematician could argue physics. A mathematician arguing hermeneutics in a world already fractured by rival interpretations looked to cautious officials like another crack in the wall. Rome, 1616. The Holy Office moved with the same deliberate pace as all its decisions. It did not need urgency. It needed precedent, paperwork, and stability. Copernicus's book was placed under restriction. The idea that the sun was the center of the world and that Earth moved was declared contrary to Scripture in the sense that it could not be held as physically true. The Church did not ban the mathematics wholesale. In practice, the calculations could still be used as a tool, so long as they were treated as hypotheses, as convenient models, not as descriptions of how reality actually was. Galileo was summoned and warned. What precisely he was told in that meeting has been argued over ever since. Galileo later maintained he was instructed not to hold or defend the doctrine as true. In the records of the Holy Office, a stricter formulation appears, an order not to teach or defend it in any way. The difference between those two phrasings mattered enormously in 1633, and it is one of the reasons the trial would become as much about obedience as about astronomy. At the time, the instruction served a larger institutional goal: maintain a boundary. Allow calculation, forbid proclamation, keep the new way of knowing inside the safe category of mathematical convenience. Do not let it become a public challenge to the interpretive authority of the Church. It was, in a sense, a return to that quiet Copernican wedge. The math works better could be tolerated as a technical matter. The sun is at the center could not be tolerated as public truth. The line was meant to protect a civilization's coherence by separating usefulness from meaning. Galileo returned to Florence, chastened but not converted. He had been given a map of the fence, and fences are hard for certain minds not to test. For years he worked within the constraint. He wrote about motion. He argued with philosophers. He pursued physics. He cultivated patrons. And he waited for the climate to change. It changed for a moment with a coronation. Rome, 1623. Maffeo Barberini became Pope Urban VIII. He was not an ignorant man. He had admired Galileo's earlier work. He had written poetry. He had an intellectual streak and a taste for prestige. In a church besieged by Protestant critique and embroiled in political maneuvering across Europe, he also understood the importance of appearing strong. Strength in a fractured world is as much theatrical as it is structural. Galileo seized the opening. He dedicated a new work, the Assayer, to the Pope's circle, and the book carried a claim that would become the hallmark of the New World view. Nature, Galileo insisted, was written in the language of mathematics. The phrase was more than a metaphor. It was a declaration that the deepest truths of reality were not captured by stories, not adjudicated by consensus, but expressed in number and measure. Urban received Galileo with warmth. In 1624, Galileo traveled to Rome and met the Pope multiple times. He left encouraged. He believed he could finally discuss Copernicanism again, so long as he framed it carefully, as a hypothesis, as a debate. This is the point where patronage, personality, and institutional fear begin to interlock like gears. Urban VIII could permit discussion if it looked controlled. Galileo could write if he appeared obedient. The Church could tolerate a conversation as long as it did not become a public assertion that threatened interpretive sovereignty. The arrangement depended on restraint, on mutual reading of unspoken limits. Galileo's genius was not matched by his caution. Florence, 1632. Galileo published Dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. It was written as a conversation between three men over several days. This format gave him plausible deniability. He could claim he was simply staging arguments. He could claim he was balanced. He could claim he was obeying the instruction to treat the matter as a hypothesis. But the dialogue did what Galileo wanted it to do. It made the Copernican system feel not only possible, but intellectually superior. It arranged the old geocentric arguments in ways that made them look strained, defensive, almost childish. It gave the New World view a voice that sounded like clarity. The book's subversive power was not that it shouted, "The sun is at the center." It did not need to. It could do something more destabilizing. It could show that the entire apparatus of explanation worked better, cleaner, more elegant, more coherent when you placed the sun at the center. It could demonstrate by sheer argumentative gravity that mathematics and reason could carry the weight of reality more effectively than inherited authority. That was exactly the problem that had been gathering for a century. A civilization can absorb many shocks if it can still tell itself a story that keeps meaning and authority aligned. But a truth that arrives through an impersonal system and then proves itself by working better is hard to contain. It does not merely contradict a passage of Scripture. It proposes a new court of appeal. The book spread quickly. It was read by educated men in Italy and beyond. It became the subject of talk. And talk is what institutions fear when institutions are already under strain. A debate in a university can be managed. A debate that spills into salons, courts, and pulpits becomes a contagion. Urban the Eighth's reaction was not only personal, though there was personal sting. One of the dialogue's characters, the defender of traditional views, was made to look foolish. Worse, Galileo put an argument associated with the Pope, an insistence that God's omnipotence meant humans could never claim full certainty about the way God chose to arrange the cosmos, into the mouth of that foolish character. In a court where pride and authority were intertwined, it looked like mockery. But there was more than pride at stake. By the early 1630s, Europe was in the grip of a vast war. Alliances shifted. Armies moved. Cities burned. The papacy navigated political peril, needing to appear firm to allies and enemies alike. In such a climate, ambiguity can look like weakness, and weakness invites attack. The Pope could not afford the appearance that the Church tolerated open defiance on a matter it had already marked as dangerous. The system responded the way systems respond. The permission that had once been flexible hardened. The same institutional machinery that had moved slowly in peacetime now moved with the urgency of self-protection. Galileo was ordered to Rome, winter 1633. The journey from Florence to Rome was not dramatic in the way modern imagination wants it to be. It was slow, uncomfortable, and shadowed by illness. Galileo was nearly 70. He suffered from ailments that made travel painful. He moved along roads that carried the residue of plague fears and the constant churn of a Europe in war. He was not hauled in chains. He was summoned, and the distinction mattered. The Church preferred obedience. Chains turn men into martyrs. Summons turn men into subjects. In Rome, Galileo stayed under the watchful care of the Tuscan ambassador at first. It was an arrangement that allowed the proceedings to maintain decorum. Diplomacy wrapped the trial in etiquette, but etiquette does not soften the essential fact. Galileo's fate was now in the hands of a tribunal designed to protect unity. When he was brought to the Holy Office, the atmosphere was not like a public spectacle. It was bureaucratic. It was controlled. It was meant to be. The Church had learned through centuries of conflict that public theater inflames factions. Quiet decisions, rendered with solemn authority, are more effective at stabilizing a fractured world. The questions Galileo faced were not framed as a debate about evidence. They were framed as questions about obedience and intent. Had he been warned in 1616? Had he violated the warning? Had he written the dialogue as a balanced discussion or as a defense of a condemned doctrine? In the room, papers mattered as much as telescopes. The tribunal produced a document from 1616. It asserted that Galileo had been ordered not merely to refrain from holding Copernicanism as true, but not to teach or defend it in any way whatsoever. If that order stood, then Galileo's dialogue was not a mistake. It was disobedience. Galileo responded as a man who understood the stakes. He did not offer the tribunal a heroic refusal. He offered explanations. He insisted he had not intended to defend the condemned doctrine. He pointed to passages where he criticized it. He emphasized his obedience. He tried to frame the dialogue as an exploration, not an assertion. This was not cowardice. It was survival. Galileo was not confronting an enemy in a duel. He was confronting a system whose strength lay in its ability to define what counted as permissible speech. The deeper conflict, though, sat beneath the legal arguments like a tectonic plate. Galileo's work implied a new relationship between mind and world. In the old world view, the world was saturated with purpose. Motion was not just movement. It was a kind of striving. Objects sought their natural place. The cosmos had direction. It was not merely a machine. It was a meaningful order. Galileo's physics, like his astronomy, did not simply revise details. It revised the kind of story that could be told. In his experiments with falling bodies and inclined planes, in his analyses of motion, he treated movement as something that could be described without reference to purpose. A ball rolled not because it desired a place, but because forces acted upon it. A body continued in motion not because it sought fulfillment, but because nothing stopped it. The word that would later capture this new vision, inert, carried the chill in its syllables. Inert, lifeless, without inner drive. The universe, rendered in this language, began to look less like a living order and more like a vast mechanism. And if the cosmos was a mechanism, then meaning no longer lived out there in the structure of things. Meaning became something the human mind brought to an indifferent world. For a civilization whose institutions had been built to unify nature, morality, and narrative, built to keep the world intelligible in a shared way, this shift was not merely intellectual. It threatened the very possibility of a common moral world. In that room in Rome, none of this needed to be stated explicitly to be felt. The tribunal's job was not to adjudicate the beauty of mathematical description. Its job was to keep a fractured civilization from splitting further. A few months after Galileo arrived, the process reached its conclusion. June 1633. The verdict was pronounced. Galileo was found vehemently suspect of heresy. He was required to abjure, to renounce the doctrine that Earth moved and the sun stood at the center. He was sentenced to imprisonment, a sentence later commuted to house arrest. His book was prohibited. The moment of abjuration has been painted in many styles since. Some imagine Galileo defiant, whispering rebellion under his breath. Others imagine him broken. The reality, as with most human moments inside institutional machinery, was likely more ordinary and more tragic. An old man, facing a tribunal that could ruin him completely, chose the only path that allowed him to live and work. He spoke the words required of him. In doing so, he did not surrender the truth of his observations. He surrendered the right to proclaim them publicly in the way he had. The tribunal did not disprove his claims. It asserted that it could define the terms on which such claims could be aired, and it punished him for crossing that boundary. That is why the trial cannot be reduced to a simple battle between ignorance and enlightenment. It was a boundary-making act. It was a civilization attempting to protect its coherence by declaring that some truths, especially truths that reorganized authority, could not be tolerated in public discourse under the terms being proposed. Galileo was sent away from Rome, away from the chair in the tribunal room. He returned to Tuscany under constraint. Arcetri, outside Florence, mid-1630s. Galileo lived in a villa under watch. The world narrowed to a horizon he could see from his windows, to letters smuggled carefully, to conversations measured for safety. The most intimate tragedy arrived not from Rome, but from a nearby convent. His daughter, Maria Celeste, died in 1634. Grief does not fit neatly into narratives of intellectual triumph or institutional oppression. It simply sits in the body and changes how the days pass. Galileo's body weakened, his eyes began to fail. The darkness that overtook him in later years was literal, but it also symbolized something the age itself was grappling with, a widening gap between what could be known and what could be lived. And yet, even in confinement, he worked. If he could not publicly proclaim the architecture of the cosmos, he could still refine the mechanics of motion. In the late 1630s, nearly blind, he dictated what would become another foundational text, discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences. In it, the language of motion became more precise, more abstract, more independent of purpose. The universe, described this way, became even more machine-like. It is hard to overstate what that meant for the story of meaning. In the old order, human purpose felt mirrored in the world. People acted for ends, and so did nature. The cosmos itself was a kind of moral architecture. When motion became inertia, when the sky became matter moving under forces, the mirror broke. Humans remained creatures of intention in a world increasingly described as intentionless. The Church's response in 1633 could not stop that transformation. It could only slow its public spread within its jurisdiction. The new way of knowing was not a doctrine that could be refuted by decree. It was a method that generated power, predictions, technologies, navigational accuracy, mechanical advantage. Once a way of knowing produces power, it attracts patrons of its own. This is where the story returns to the title's deeper claim. In 1633, it looked like Galileo had been placed on the stand. In a literal sense, he had. He had been questioned, judged, and compelled to recant. But in a deeper sense, the trial placed something else on trial, the civilization's own capacity to keep its world coherent. Because the tribunal's strategy, permit the math, forbid the metaphysics, allow calculation, forbid proclamation, depended on a boundary that the new way of knowing did not respect. Mathematics does not politely remain a tool when it begins to outperform inherited explanations. Instruments do not remain toys when they reveal facts that everyone can verify. The line between "this is a hypothesis for calculation" and "this is how the world really is" becomes harder to enforce the more successful the method becomes. That had been Copernicus's quiet disturbance almost a century earlier. It could be framed as an innocent claim. The math works better. But a civilization built on shared authority cannot treat "works better" as neutral for long, because "works better" begins to decide what counts as real. Galileo's trial was therefore not merely a moment of suppression. It was an attempted repair, a bureaucratic suture across a widening wound. And like many repairs made under fear, it produced a legacy that later generations would misunderstand. In the centuries that followed, Galileo became a symbol. Symbols simplify. They erase the complexity of the Jesuits who verified telescopic evidence. They erase the cautious compromise models that tried to reconcile observation with tradition. They erase the political realities of a papacy managing war and fracture. They erase the patronage network that had protected Galileo until it could not. They erase the fact that the trial was as much about the governance of speech as it was about the governance of planets. The myth that emerged, science as a lone hero, religion as a blind jailer, was emotionally satisfying. But it was not the full truth. The full truth was more unsettling because it implicates more than one side. It suggests that civilizations, when under strain, will treat disorienting truths as threats to order. It suggests that institutions that exist to preserve coherence will often prioritize stability over openness, not always out of malice, but out of fear that without their custodianship, meaning will dissolve into faction and violence. It also suggests something else, that the new way of knowing, for all its power, does not automatically supply what the old coherence supplied. It can tell you how the heavens move. It can tell you how bodies fall. It can build clocks and cannons and ships that cross oceans. But it does not tell you where you belong. That is why the trial of Galileo mattered so much to the people who lived through it. Not because they were choosing between truth and falsehood in some simple sense, but because they were struggling with a civilization-level question. How do you keep a shared world when the methods that reveal reality no longer carry the meanings that once made reality livable? Back in Rome, in that tribunal room, the chair did not merely represent a man's fate. It represented the hope that a civilization could still control the terms of truth. Galileo left Rome alive, but constrained. The Church left the episode with its authority asserted, but its dilemma unresolved. The new way of knowing continued to spread, slowly at first, then with accelerating force, carried by the practical victories it delivered. And the old coherence continued to thin, replaced not by nothing, but by a new arrangement, a world of objective measures and subjective meanings, a universe described as mechanism and lived as longing. If the trial has an enduring lesson, it is not that truth always wins and authority always loses. The lesson is harsher and more useful. A civilization can survive many errors. What it struggles to survive is losing agreement about how reality is decided. In 1633, Rome tried to preserve that agreement by putting Galileo on the stand. In the long run, the stand held him for a moment, but it could not hold the transformation he represented. The numbers kept working, the instruments kept revealing, the method kept winning, and the civilization, whether it admitted it or not, was the one being judged by its own capacity to adapt, to reweave meaning around a world that was becoming, with every successful calculation, less like a home and more like an immense silent machine.